She stood at her father's graveside when her husband handed her the divorce papers. The October wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the scent of fresh earth and fading flowers. The pastor had just finished the final prayer. Neighbors were still wiping their eyes, and he chose that moment, with her father's casket still resting in the ground, to end their marriage. He believed he was humiliating a grieving daughter at her most fragile hour. What he did not know, what no one standing among those headstones understood yet, was that every foundation he had ever stood on had been built quietly by her hands. It was a Thursday evening in late October, the kind of night where Atlanta still held a little warmth in the air, just enough that the women coming in from the parking lot didn't need their wraps yet. The Meridian Hotel ballroom had been rented for the occasion, a polished, well-lit space with round tables dressed in white linen, soft gold lighting along the walls, and the kind of quiet luxury that says money without ever having to shout about it. This was the Webb Real Estate Group's annual investor showcase, the event where Damon Webb stood before the people who had trusted him with their money and reminded them why they were right to do so. And Damon Webb knew how to work a room. That was never in question. He was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, with a voice that could slow a conversation down just by entering it. He wore a deep navy suit, had his hair faded clean, and smiled the way men smile when they have already decided the night belongs to them. He greeted investors at the door. He shook hands. He laughed at the right moments. He was, by every outward measure, the kind of man other men studied and women admired. The narrator watched him work that room and understood exactly how Lorraine Webb had fallen in love with him 20 years ago. That part was easy to understand. What was harder to understand was how a man like that, a man with so much, decided it wasn't enough. Lorraine Webb stood near the back of the room. If you were not looking for her, you would not have found her. She wore a simple, deep green dress, nothing elaborate, nothing that demanded attention. Her hair was pulled back softly. Her hands were still at her sides, and on her left wrist, so thin you had to look twice to notice it, was a small gold bracelet that caught the light just once when she shifted her weight. She was watching everything. Not nervously, not sadly, not with the restless alertness of someone waiting for something to go wrong, the way still water watches, taking everything in without disturbing the surface. She had been in this room from the beginning of the evening. She had watched the caterers arrange the tables. She had watched the early guests arrive. She had watched her husband greet each of them, and she had noted, as she always noted, exactly who he spent his time on, and exactly what his body language said when he thought no one who mattered was watching. Lorraine had always been someone who noticed everything. It was just that nobody had ever noticed her noticing. The room filled. The program began. Damon took the microphone with the easy confidence of a man born to hold one, and for the first 20 minutes, he delivered exactly what the room expected. Investment returns, property acquisitions, future development plans for properties across Atlanta, Birmingham, and Charlotte. He talked about a mixed-use development in Midtown that was 2 months from breaking ground, and a residential acquisition in Charlotte that had already doubled its projected return. He used words like legacy and vision and building something that lasts. He was good. He was polished. The applause came freely and genuinely. There was a moment, maybe 12 minutes into the presentation, where Damon looked toward the back of the room and his eyes passed over Lorraine the way you pass over something familiar, not registering it, not pausing on it, just moving through it on the way to something else. Lorraine noticed. She always noticed. But she did not shift her weight or change her expression. She simply continued watching the way she had watched him for 14 years, with complete attention that he had long ago stopped knowing was there. And then the night shifted. It happened without warning, the way all true betrayals happen. One moment the air in the room was warm and celebratory. The next moment, it was something else entirely. Damon cleared his throat, set his notes aside, and looked out at the crowd with an expression that the narrator can only describe as rehearsed vulnerability. The kind of look a man practices in a mirror before he delivers news he has already convinced himself is justified. He said that before closing the evening, he had a personal announcement to share. He said that life sometimes moves in directions we don't expect. He said that he and his wife, Lorraine, had grown in different directions over the years, and that after much reflection, they had made the decision to separate. The room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it does not know how to react. A few heads turned. A few eyes found Lorraine at the back of the room. She did not move. Damon continued. He said he wanted to be transparent with his investors and colleagues. He said he had found real happiness again, and that he was grateful for the support of the people in that room. And then, without a pause, without a breath of decency between the words, he extended his right hand toward the side of the stage, and Tiffany Cole walked out. Tiffany Cole was 34 years old. She was beautiful in the way that made certain women in that room press their lips together and look at their shoes. She wore a fitted red dress, her hair down, her smile wide and unashamed. She took Damon's hand like she had rehearsed it. She faced the crowd like she deserved to be there, and she had been, for the past 3 years, the head of public relations for the Webb Real Estate Group, a position that Lorraine herself had championed Tiffany for after seeing her present at a small business forum. Lorraine had sat across from Tiffany at their own kitchen table, had passed her the good coffee, had told her she had something real, and that she should never let anyone convince her otherwise. Tiffany had called Lorraine Big Sis back then, had sent her a handwritten thank you card that Lorraine kept on the refrigerator for 6 months. That was the card that was hardest to think about now. Because the thing about real betrayal, the kind that cuts at a different depth than ordinary disappointment, is that it almost always comes wearing the face of gratitude. It almost always comes from someone you helped, someone you looked at and said, "I see something worth believing in." And the card on the refrigerator was Lorraine's own handwriting reflected back at her. The choice she had made, the woman she had lifted, now standing on stage in a red dress holding her husband's hand. The narrator has heard people say that betrayal from a stranger is a crime, but betrayal from someone you invested in is something closer to grief. That is the only word that fits what Lorraine felt in that moment, looking at Tiffany Cole under those gold lights. Not rage, grief. The cameras that 2 local media outlets had brought to cover the showcase had already turned toward the back of the room, finding Lorraine's face. The narrator remembers this moment with a particular kind of weight, because what those cameras captured, what millions of people would later see when the footage circulated, was a woman who simply did not react. Not because she was numb, not because she was shocked, but because she had already understood, on a level deeper than the moment, that this was not the place where she would respond. This was not the ground she had chosen. Lorraine Webb looked at her husband of 14 years standing on stage holding another woman's hand. She held eye contact with him for exactly 3 seconds, and then she looked down at the thin gold bracelet on her wrist, and her lips moved, just barely, in something that was not quite a smile and not quite a prayer, but somewhere quiet and certain in between. In the front row, Damon's mother, Gloria Webb, sat with her hands folded in her lap, and when Tiffany appeared on stage, Gloria Webb nodded, just once. The small, satisfied nod of a woman who had been waiting for this outcome for a very long time. The betrayal was not one thing. It was 3 things, layered on top of each other like floors of a building. The husband who had made a public spectacle of their marriage in a room full of cameras. The woman she had lifted, now standing in her place with her hand in her husband's. And the mother who had never seen Lorraine as worthy of her son, and was now watching this moment with quiet approval. 3 floors, all of them rotting, and Lorraine Webb stood at the back of the room, alone in the most crowded way a person can be alone, and she held her bracelet, and she breathed, and she waited for the moment that she, and only she, already knew was coming. To understand Lorraine Webb, you have to go back to Mississippi. You have to go back to a small, proud, immaculately kept house on a quiet road outside of Natchez, where the front porch held 2 wooden chairs that were never empty on Sunday mornings. You have to go back to a man named Elias Dupont. Elias Dupont was not a large man in the physical sense. He was medium height, lean, with hands that had worked hard enough to show it, and eyes that had been kind long enough to settle into the permanent expression of someone who had made peace with the world on his own terms. He had run the Natchez Community Credit Union out of a converted church annex building for 22 years. He had never been featured in a magazine. He had never given a TED Talk. He had never owned a suit that cost more than $200. But every person in that community who had ever needed to understand money, really understand it, not just spend it, had sat across from Elias Dupont at his small wooden desk and learned something they carried for the rest of their lives. Lorraine's mother had passed when Lorraine was 9 years old, a quiet sickness that came in the spring and did not leave by summer. Lorraine did not remember much about that year except for the way her father never let her feel like she was missing something. He cooked. He braided her hair badly and accepted her honest assessment of his work without complaint. He read to her at night from books that were sometimes too old for her and explained the words she didn't know. He called her still water from the time she was 5 years old, because he said she was always the quietest one in any room and the deepest. He gave her the bracelet on her 18th birthday, thin gold, nothing extravagant, but real. He had driven to a jewelry shop in Jackson to get it made the way he wanted it, not from a display case, but custom, because he said anything worth giving should have been worth thinking about first. On the inside face, in lettering so small you had to bring it close to your eye to read it, were 2 words: still water. She had worn it every single day since, through college, through the wedding, through every hard season of a life that had more hard seasons than people who looked at her from the outside ever would have guessed. The bracelet was not ornamental. It was a compass, a reminder that her father had known who she was before she had fully known it herself, and that his knowing had never wavered. Elias taught his daughter 3 things that he repeated so consistently they became part of her internal structure rather than just memories. The first, never show your hand until the game is over. The second, build in silence and let success make the noise. The third, the one he said the most quietly, the one that settled deepest. The woman who controls the foundation controls everything built on top of it. Lorraine went to college on a partial scholarship and 2 jobs. She studied finance because numbers had always spoken to her in the same steady, honest way her father did. She sent money home. She graduated in 3 years, and at a university economic development forum during her final semester, she met Damon Webb. He was electric. There is no more honest word for it. He walked into a room, and the oxygen rearranged itself. He had ideas that were bold enough to be exciting and grounded enough to be real. He told Lorraine she was the most interesting person he had talked to all night, and she believed him because he said it the way people say things that are true, plainly, without decoration. What Damon saw in Lorraine in those early years was warmth and steadiness. What he did not see, what he never allowed himself to fully see, was the depth. He loved the surface of her, the gentleness, the calm, the way she managed things without drama. But he mistook her quiet for smallness. He mistook her patience for the absence of ambition. He looked at still water and saw a pond when he was standing at the edge of something with no visible bottom. 6 months after their wedding, Damon's first major real estate venture collapsed, A development deal in Birmingham had gone sideways. Two investors had pulled funding, and the company was bleeding money fast enough that Damon couldn't sleep. Lorraine spent 3 weeks quietly, without telling him, without making it about herself, restructuring the approach. She renegotiated 2 of the contracts through back channels, identified a financing instrument Damon had never heard of, and reframed the investor pitch in language that addressed the exact fears they had raised. She laid it all out for him on a Sunday morning over coffee and let him present it as his own idea. The company survived. Damon believed he had saved it. Lorraine let him believe that, because she loved him then, completely, in the way that people love when they are still whole. The gold bracelet caught the kitchen light that Sunday morning, the same way it would catch the light in that hotel ballroom more than a decade later. And Elias Dupont, 3 states away, watered his tomato plants on his front porch and knew, the way fathers know things without being told, that his daughter was quietly holding up more than she was being given credit for. The 3 years before the investor showcase were, if you looked at them from the outside, years of success. The Webb Real Estate Group grew. Properties were acquired. The brand expanded. Damon's name appeared in Atlanta business publications with increasing regularity. From the outside, everything looked like exactly what it was supposed to look like. From the inside, it was something else. It started with Gloria Webb and her quiet campaign. Gloria had never warmed to Lorraine, not in the casual sense of 2 women who simply move in different circles, but in the deliberate, sustained sense of a woman who had decided early and committed to that decision. She called Lorraine too quiet at family dinners, too plain, too country, not the right kind of woman for a man with Damon's ambitions. For years, she said these things in the particular way that mothers say damaging things to their sons, not as accusations, but as concern, as love, as wanting only the best. And Damon, who had been raised to trust his mother's read on people, absorbed it over time the way ground absorbs slow rain, without noticing how saturated he was becoming. When Tiffany Cole joined the company, Gloria Webb recognized her immediately as a possibility. Tiffany was socially fluent in a way that made events easier. She was loud in the right rooms and quiet in the right rooms. She photographed well beside Damon at industry functions. Within 8 months of joining the company, the nature of her relationship with Damon had shifted entirely. Gloria knew. She said nothing to Damon about it being wrong. She said nothing at all, which was, the narrator would like you to understand, the same as saying it was fine. Tiffany was smart enough to understand that the most dangerous thing to her position was not Lorraine's grief or anger. It was Lorraine's knowledge. Lorraine knew the company's finances at a structural level that no one else in the organization matched. She had been, quietly and without title, the financial architecture behind some of the company's most successful moves for over a decade. If that came to light, if Damon ever truly understood what Lorraine had contributed, the narrative Tiffany needed him to believe would fall apart. So Tiffany built another narrative first. It took 6 months to construct. She was careful and patient about it in a way that the narrator, who has seen many kinds of betrayal, found particularly cold. Because patience in service of kindness is one of the most beautiful human qualities, and patience in service of destruction is something else entirely. It is the application of discipline toward a dark end, and it requires a particular kind of person to sustain it. Tiffany Cole was that particular kind of person. She fabricated account statements, manufactured 2 email threads that appeared to show irregular fund transfers bearing Lorraine's digital signature, and assembled a set of supporting documents suggesting that Lorraine had been quietly redirecting company funds for personal use across a period of 18 months. She did not do this alone. She retained an outside financial consultant, paying him privately in cash for his technical knowledge. But she was the architect. She chose which documents to target, Which dollar amounts would look credible without being enormous enough to trigger immediate outside scrutiny, and which moments in Damon's calendar to begin presenting the evidence piece by piece, when he was already in states of stress or frustration that made him most receptive to a story that confirmed what Gloria had been quietly suggesting for years. When Damon finally sat across from Lorraine at their kitchen table with those documents in front of him, his voice was not angry. It was worse than angry. It was certain. He had already arrived at his conclusion before sitting down. He laid the papers flat on the table and told Lorraine that he had seen the evidence, that he was going to the company's board, that she needed to consider this a formal separation of their finances effective immediately, that he had trusted her and she had stolen from the family they built together. Lorraine looked at the papers. She understood immediately what they were. She understood who had built them and how. She looked at her husband's face, the certainty there, the closed quality of his expression, the way he had stacked the papers neatly, as if to say the case was already organized and concluded. And she said nothing. Not because she had no words. She had every word. But because she could see, with the absolute clarity that only comes to people who have been trained their whole lives to read the foundation beneath a structure, that speaking in this moment would be wasted. This moment was not the one. The one she needed was still ahead. That night, she drove 3 hours south, through Georgia into Mississippi, on roads she had memorized before she could drive them, past the kind of landscape that does not change because it has never needed to. She arrived at her father's house after midnight. Elias was in his final weeks. He had been declining through the fall, quietly, the way he did everything, and she had been driving down every 2 weeks to sit with him. She had not told him about Tiffany, had not told him about Gloria's campaign, had not told him what was happening to her marriage because she had not wanted to add weight to a man who was already carrying the enormous, private labor of preparing to leave this world. But that night, on his front porch, with the Mississippi darkness around them and the sound of insects in the distance, and his hand resting on top of hers, she told him everything. She talked for a long time, and for most of it, Elias Dupont said nothing. He just listened the way he had always listened, fully present, not preparing his response, not measuring her pain against some standard of what warranted reaction. He just received it. When she finished, the porch was quiet for a long time. Then Elias turned to look at his daughter and said, in that voice that had never once in her life been anything but the most honest sound she had ever heard, "Still water. You've been building for 14 years and that man don't even know what floor he's standing on. Don't fight him, baby. Just let go of the hand you're holding and open the one you've been hiding." 4 days later, Elias Dupont passed away on a Tuesday morning in March, in his own bed, in his own house, with the sunrise coming through the window the way it always did. The woman from next door who had been helping with his care called Lorraine at 6:17 in the morning. Lorraine was already awake. She had not slept that night. She drove the 3 hours back without stopping, and when she arrived, the house was already full of the gentle, purposeful movement of a community that knows how to take care of its own in grief. Damon Webb did not attend the funeral. He was, according to a calendar notification his assistant forwarded to Lorraine, in a meeting with critical investors. The meeting, which Lorraine later confirmed through channels he did not know she had access to, was a dinner with Tiffany at a restaurant in Buckhead. Lorraine buried her father with the Natchez community around her. The elders who had known him for 40 years, the families whose children he had taught about credit and compound interest, and the quiet architecture of financial dignity. The woman who had brought casseroles to their house when Lorraine's mother passed. The deacon who had let Elias run the credit union out of the church annex because he understood that financial education was a form of ministry. They came and they held her, and they wept for a man who had spent his whole life making sure that the people around him knew they were worth something. At the grave, when the ceremony was over and people had begun the slow, loving migration toward the reception hall, Lorraine stood alone for a moment. She removed her wedding ring. She held it for a few seconds, looking at it, not dramatically, not with theater, just honestly. Then she placed it gently in the earth beside the headstone. She kept the bracelet. She straightened her back. She took one long, steady breath, and she walked to her car. The narrator would like to pause here and say, as directly as possible, something did die with Elias Dupont that day. The part of Lorraine that was still waiting for Damon to see her. The part that was still holding the marriage like a question she hoped would be answered differently. That part was done. But something else, something that had been waiting for a very long time with the patience that only comes from being raised by a man who understood that timing is everything, finally woke all the way up. The repast following Elias Dupont's funeral was held at the Shiloh Baptist Church reception hall, 3 blocks from the credit union annex where he had worked for over 2 decades. It was not glamorous. It was long folding tables with white plastic covers. It was potato salad made by 5 different women, each of whom believed with complete sincerity that hers was the superior version. It was gospel music low on a speaker in the corner, and children running between adult legs, and men in their good suits standing with paper plates balanced in one hand, and stories about Elias Dupont in the other. It was exactly the world he had built. Exactly the world that had built Lorraine. This is where she chose to end the war. Not a boardroom, not a gala, not a red dress and an elevator speech and a moment engineered for maximum dramatic impact. Lorraine Webb chose the church reception hall in Natchez, Mississippi, because it was her father's ground. Because these were her people. Because if there was ever going to be a moment of truth in her life, it was going to happen somewhere real, with people who knew the difference between performance and substance. She was standing near the food table, speaking with 2 of her father's oldest friends, men in their 70s who had known Elias since before she was born, when the doors to the reception hall opened and Damon Webb walked in. He came late, the way people come to events they are attending for optics rather than grief. His suit was correct. His expression was calibrated to appropriate solemnity. His lawyer, a compact man named Gene who carried a leather folder everywhere he went, walked a half step behind him. And on Damon's right arm, in a dress that was perhaps 30% too formal for a church reception hall in Natchez, was Tiffany Cole. And behind them both, moving with the particular self-possession of a woman who has decided she is above the weather, came Gloria Webb. They crossed the room. Lorraine watched them come the way she watched everything, without adjustment, without acceleration of breath. The 2 elderly men beside her fell silent, reading the room the way old people read rooms, which is to say completely and immediately. Damon reached the food table. He looked at Lorraine with an expression that the narrator can only describe as the face of a man who has confused winning with being right. He reached inside his jacket and produced a folded set of papers. He set them on the table in front of Lorraine, between the potato salad and a tray of deviled eggs. And he said, "Just sign it, Lorraine. Let's make this clean." Gene set the leather folder down and clicked his pen. Tiffany stood at Damon's shoulder, her chin lifted. Gloria folded her hands. The room, which had been full of conversation and the sound of the children and the low gospel music, went quiet in the particular, spreading way that quiet moves through a room full of people who understand something important is happening. The elders heard it first, then the deacons, then the women at the other tables. The music didn't stop, but everything underneath it did. Lorraine picked up the divorce papers. She read them, every page, slowly, with the complete, unhurried attention of someone who reads documents the way most people read letters, looking for what they actually mean rather than what they appear to say. The silence stretched. Gene shifted his weight. Tiffany's expression remained fixed, but the stillness of it required visible effort now. Then Lorraine's phone rang. She answered it on speaker without hesitation, without explanation, without looking at Damon. The voice that came through the phone was deep and measured, with the particular quality of authority that comes from having never needed to perform it. It filled the church reception hall in Natchez, Mississippi, like a presence that had not been invited, but was undeniably real. Mrs. Webb, this is Roland Achebe. The board has reviewed your proposal. We have unanimous approval to move forward. We are prepared to begin the acquisition at your stated valuation. $20.3 billion. Congratulations, Mrs. Webb. Your father would be proud. The call ended. The room did not breathe. Damon Webb stood at the food table in a church reception hall in Natchez, Mississippi, with a set of divorce papers in front of his wife and the number $20.3 billion hanging in the air between them like weather. His face moved through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, calculation, something close to recognition, something that looked very much like the beginning of understanding arriving far too late. Tiffany's smile was gone. It had left quickly and cleanly, the way smiles leave when the story that supported them has been removed from underneath. Gloria Webb's hand slipped from the fold at her front. She looked at her son, then at Lorraine, then at the phone still in Lorraine's hand. She said nothing. Before anyone in that room had fully processed the phone call, the doors to the reception hall opened again. 4 people walked in quietly. 2 men and 2 women, all dressed in understated professional attire. Dark suits, no display. They crossed the room with the easy certainty of people who are exactly where they are supposed to be, and they positioned themselves behind Lorraine in a loose half-circle. Not aggressive, not theatrical, simply present, simply standing where they stood. They were members of the board of directors of the DuPont Legacy Group, named for Elias DuPont, built over 11 years in complete and deliberate silence, constructed through a network of community credit unions, 19 of them across 6 southern states, Black-owned development funds, and strategic real estate holdings in 7 states. Built using every principle Elias had ever taught, refined by the mind of a woman who had been managing money at an architectural level since before she had a title for it. Built during late nights when Damon was at industry events. Built during weekends when Lorraine was supposedly home being simple. Built over 14 years of being called ordinary. The narrator now gives you the information that Damon Webb was never given. The information that Tiffany and Gloria worked so hard to bury beneath their fabricated story before Lorraine could ever reveal it herself. The Webb Real Estate Group's primary headquarters, the building from which Damon had run his company for 6 years, the address on every press release and investor document and business card, sat on a lease. That lease was held by a property management holding company. That holding company was owned by a parent LLC. That LLC was a wholly owned subsidiary of the DuPont Legacy Group. Lorraine Webb had been Damon Webb's landlord for 6 years. Every rent check the company had written, every lease renewal, all of it had been flowing, quietly and legally, back to his wife, the foundation under everything he had built. His wife had been holding it the entire time, and he had never once thought to look down. One of the board members set a certified document case on the table beside the divorce papers. Inside was the complete forensic audit of the fabricated financial fraud Tiffany had constructed. Every manipulated statement, every falsified transfer document, every manufactured email dismantled with precision and documented for legal submission. The DuPont Legacy Group's legal and financial forensics team had been working on it for 8 months. Lorraine looked at Damon for a long, quiet moment. The kind of look that does not need words because it has already said everything in the time it has taken him to arrive at this moment. She looked at Tiffany. She looked at Gloria. Then she picked up the pen that Jean had set down. She signed the divorce papers herself, Every page, calmly, completely, without one tear, without one word spoken above a quiet, steady tone. She slid the papers back across the table, and then she said 5 words. "The lease expires next month." She turned away from the table. She walked back to the 2 elderly men who had known her father since before she was born, and she sat down beside them, and she picked up a plate of food, and she continued the conversation. What happened to Damon Webb after that day was not a single dramatic collapse. It was the steady, structural kind of failure that happens when someone discovers that the foundation beneath everything they built was never actually theirs. The headquarters lease was not renewed. Lorraine made that decision through the proper channels with 30 days formal notice, as required by the contract. A contract, it is worth noting, that she had written the original terms of 11 years prior. Without that address, the address that anchored every investor relationship, every regulatory filing, every piece of institutional credibility the company had built over a decade. 3 major investment partners exercised exit clauses within 60 days. A 4th followed shortly after. The company's valuation, which had been the centerpiece of Damon's entire identity, fell in a way that was not recoverable in the short term. His name still appeared in business publications, but now in the sections that cover restructuring, not ascension. The forensic audit documents that the DuPont Legacy Group submitted to the relevant authorities triggered a federal inquiry into the fabricated financial fraud. Tiffany Cole was the central subject of that inquiry. She resigned from the Webb Real Estate Group before she was formally asked to leave on a quiet Friday afternoon, having sent no farewell message to any colleague. She reached out to Lorraine twice through a mutual contact in the weeks that followed. Lorraine did not respond to either message, not out of cruelty, out of the simple, grounded understanding that some doors close permanently, and that is not a tragedy. It is a resolution. Gloria Webb lost, with remarkable efficiency, the social standing she had spent years constructing in Atlanta's business circles. The Natchez community, the elders, the deacons, the women who made the potato salad, the families Elias DuPont had served for 22 years, had long memories and quiet networks. Word moved the way it always moves in communities that know each other deeply, without announcement, without drama, but completely. The narrator does not celebrate these outcomes. The narrator reports them the way a steady man reports weather that arrives exactly when the season demands it. It rained. The way it always does when the foundation cracks. When you build on something you do not own and never truly understood, you are always one moment of truth away from discovering what your structure is actually worth. In the spring that followed, Lorraine Webb sat on the front porch of her father's house in Natchez, Mississippi. The house had been fully restored over the past 2 years. New paint in a warm cream color that Elias had always said he wanted but never gotten to. Fresh wood on the porch boards. The 2 wooden chairs still in the same position they had always been. It was early morning. The light was doing what Mississippi light does in spring, coming in golden and unhurried across the front yard, making everything it touched look like it had been waiting patiently for exactly this. She had a coffee cup in both hands. She was not on her phone. She was not reviewing documents. She was not preparing for a meeting or managing a crisis or holding up the invisible weight of something that someone else would later take credit for. She was simply present, on her father's porch, in the world he had built carefully and quietly over a lifetime. The DuPont Legacy Group had, in the month since that October evening in the hotel ballroom, completed its acquisition and expanded into 2 new markets. The board had offered Lorraine the official title of Chief Executive Officer, and she had accepted it with the same quiet manner in which she had built everything, without ceremony, without announcement, simply by showing up and doing the work. There had been profiles written, interviews requested, a magazine that wanted her face on the cover. She agreed to some of them, not because she needed the recognition, but because Elias had told her that the woman who controls the foundation controls everything built on top of it. And he had not said that, so she could hide forever. He had said it so she would know the difference between hiding and waiting. She was done waiting now. She was wearing the gold bracelet. It caught the morning light the way it always caught light, once, briefly, like a quiet acknowledgement from something that has been carrying the truth for a long time and is finally in the right place to let it rest. The narrator wants to sit in this moment for a little while, because the whole story lives here, in this image. Not in the reception hall, not in the phone call, not in the 5 words that ended a marriage and exposed a lie. All of that was necessary. But this porch, this light, this coffee, this woman who has finally set down every weight that was never hers to carry, this is where the story actually arrives. She looked out at the yard her father had kept for 30 years. She touched the bracelet with 2 fingers, and she smiled. Not for anyone watching, not for any camera, not for the satisfaction of having been proven right. She smiled for Elias, for the man who had called her still water since she was 5 years old and had been right about her every single day since. Still water, quiet, patient, endlessly deep, moving toward the sea in its own time and in its own way, and unable to be stopped by anything that does not understand what it is. The narrator wants to close this story with one truth, not a long speech, not a list of lessons. One truth, the way Elias Dupont always closed one truth at a time. They will always underestimate the woman who moves in silence. They will call her simple when she is strategic. They will call her weak when she is waiting. They will call her nothing, right up until the moment she shows them everything. Dignity does not need to announce itself. Real power never does. Elias Dupont knew that, and he raised a daughter who understood it in her bones. They never destroyed Lorraine Webb. They just cleared the path. If this story moved something in you, share it with one woman in your life who has been carrying more than people know. Drop a comment below telling me, what was the moment in this story that hit you the hardest? Was it the funeral, the phone call, the 5 words at the end? Tell me. And if you are new here, subscribe right now, because every single week we bring you stories exactly like this one, where silence wins, where dignity survives, and where the truth always finds its way to the surface. Lorraine Webb built $20 billion in the dark. The least we can do is make sure her story reaches the light.